afternoon and welcome to Office Hours. I am Joe Perfetti, host of our show here on the YouTube live broadcast. Today, in this episode of Office Hours, we're going to talk about strategic agility and making decisions under uncertainty. And joining me are my very special guests and colleagues, Jim Austin, Kathy Pearson, and returning guest Bob Parker. So just very quickly, introductions. Jim, do you want to get us started?
Sure, Joe. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Austin. I worked overseas for a number of years in the country of Botswana as an economist. I then joined Baxter with Baxter Healthcare for 12 years as Vice President of Global Strategy. And now I do executive education at Brown in their School of Professional Services, as well as I'm a consultant lecturer at the Wharton School.
Great. No, and worked with Jim for years. Very trusted colleague. So thanks for agreeing to be on the show. Kathy?
Hi, I'm Kathy Pearson. Thanks for having me, Joe and everyone. I, too, taught extensively at the University of Pennsylvania at the Wharton School. I'm an engineer by training, actually. Sort of my area is decision sciences, very interested in how people make decisions, particularly under uncertainty. Started my own firm about 8.5 years ago. Still spend some time with Wharton and other academic institutions, but also work with clients on my own. And when you're in the business of managing uncertainty, business is pretty good in that context right now. Thanks for having me, Joe.
Everything you said over the years, Kathy, is coming true. And Bob?
Thanks, Joe. My name is Bob Parker. I run an experiential learning program called the Pit Crew Challenge, which is all about high-performing cultures, and we put a lot of these principles and jam it into this experiential program.
Yeah, and again, as I said, Bob has been a recurring host on our show, so I want to thank him for doing it. And I'm Joe Perfetti. I've been teaching equity analysis and did a lot of research on strategic agility, which is one of the reasons why we want to talk about the show. All of our research is basically from the topics we're talking about, references, as well as the content you're going to hear today from Jim, Kathy, and Bob is available at our website, learningcommunities.com, which is where the live broadcast is. If you're watching on YouTube Live, you're also welcome to put a question in the comments to the Office Hours crew here. Our goal at Office Hours was to take some leading subject matter experts and talk about current issues. In this case, we're talking about decisions under uncertainty, and also to give you a chance to ask us some questions. Because in today's online learning environment, we find it's been a one-way conversation. You watch things, but you don't have a chance to kind of apply it, understand the tools, the practical examples and anecdotes, and here's your chance to ask the experts live on the session as we're having that conversation. So feel free to put, if you're watching on YouTube Live, any questions or comments in the chat, and we will try and respond to them. But as we get started here today, as I said, our show is going to focus on making decisions under uncertainty, which is one of the premises of Agile. And so, Jim, I know you and Kathy do a lot of work on agility. So do you have a good definition for agility, Jim?
Well, Joe, why don't you pull up that one slide that I had? Strategic agility is really balancing internal concepts with external concepts. And in particular, this was a survey done in the Chicagoland area where I live, Chicagoland area, of senior executives, how they define strategic agility. So number one is, how are we going to succeed in that volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world? How do you anticipate changing situations? How can you lead across your organization? Where are your strengths? Where are your development areas? And how do you adapt your style to those different needs? Let me turn it over to others for their comments too.
Yeah, Jim, it's interesting that you talk about the adaptability piece. It's funny, as you well know, we all have talked about this need for adaptability, agility, pivoting, whatever you want to call it, flexibility. And it really has been a buzzword, over the last 10 years for sure. But, it's funny because it seems to me now, when I'm talking to clients now in this COVID world, they really get it. Like it's not a passive sort of adjective. It's an active verb. Literally people will say, Kathy, I'm trying to think about my strategy, but I don't even know what's going to happen next week. We're just going to have to adapt as we go. And they really mean it. They understand what it is. So I think it's fascinating to think about. just how this has become a real tangible skill that I think people understand.
So I have a personal thought on something that I think relates to the agility, because I think it relates to time scale, and that the world has always changed. It's just changing at a faster rate that we're experiencing. And that's why Agile's become more important. But one of the things I've noticed as I've gotten older is that the days seem to be going by faster than they ever used to be. And I was trying to wonder why. And somebody actually shared with me, they said, look, the day as a percentage of your life is now a smaller and smaller part. So to you, you actually experience it at a faster rate than you did when you were younger and the days were a longer percentage of your life. And it actually kind of made sense in a very depressing way. So that as we get older, it gets faster. And I think agility, in a way, as you talked about the last 10 years, is the same thing, is that the virtual days that we're experiencing as leaders, because there's so much information that's coming at us, and we're exponentially getting information, that percentage of that information is getting smaller and smaller. And as a result, it feels like things are moving faster and we're actually losing control. And that's why I think people are so much struggling with things that have been around forever.
Do you think, Joe, in that context, do you think that in times of high uncertainty like we're facing right now, the cost of bad decisions also become that much greater?
Absolutely. And actually, that's why you're seeing frameworks like Kinefin, and I know, Kathy, you've been talking about this as well, which is the cost of inaction. The new decision-making models are based on acting, not waiting.
That's right.
The cost of waiting is too long. And I actually think there's going to be another definition of competitive advantage, meaning we've been working with Rita McGrath, and she, I think, has usurped Michael Porter with the idea of transient advantage versus Porter's kind of traditional, moat theory of advantage. And I think the next advantage is going to be the rate of learning. Can I outlearn you? And the only way I outlearn you is if I out-experience you. And I actually start to learn by making those small bets and what, Kathy, you call those experiments at a faster rate. And that's going to actually allow me to know more and do more than you will while you're trying to wait for Godot.
It's interesting. There's some work by a group called, I'm just thinking about that whole word learning and, learning culture, and we want to be a learning organization. That term has been around for so long. And as you guys know, and you all do this as well, I'm less about individual capabilities and more about organizational capabilities. Like what kind of organization, Bob's excited.
Bob, I like your reaction, Bob.
I'll come to you in just a minute. But this idea of, who first came up with it? Peter Senge, I think, with the whole learning organization. So this group, Burton and Associates, came up with 40 different characteristics of a learning organization, which is a little touchy-feely. As an engineer, I'm looking for, the numbers, right? But then they looked at all those 40 characteristics and said which ones were most highly correlated with good outcomes. Now you're talking my language, right? And it's interesting. The top 3 that they found were, number 1, I can give my boss bad news. Like leaders can take bad news. Think about what that means.
Right.
Number 2, we encourage questions. Like we want people to learn. It's okay to say, I don't know. And the 3rd is that we have a robust and transparent decision process. Yep. Those are key components, I would argue, for agility. Bob, I know you wanted to say something.
Thanks, Kathy. I mean, for me, so I appreciate that as an organization, we've got to learn faster than the next organization for sure. And I think that's the individualness that I'll allow. But within organizations, as people are trying to figure out how they position, learning is huge. And for me, it's all about coaching culture. So it moves away from that idea of a learning organization to a coaching organization, which is still a learning organization. Don't get me wrong, but it's just in how we learn. It's not so much individual. It's the fact that we actually do coach each other, and which is asking questions, being open to making wrong decisions and being challenged for them, and learning from that. So the coaching culture is for me the most agile thing that we can do. And so what that translates into, it's all those soft skills that they end up in that coaching culture. All those, those harder skills get moved aside very quickly in order to create this agile organization.
When I hear Bob talking about that, to me, there's always tension between internal and external. But to me, a coaching is more of that internal. I may be wrong in that. How do we also stand? How do we also keep that concept of, at the same time I'm trying to develop my team, I've got to be focused on everything going on outside.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, by the way, we're getting some audio feedback. I don't know if you're noticing it. Is everybody else noticing that?
I did notice it a bit.
Yeah, I think, Jim, I don't know if you have a microphone handy you can plug in, but we're getting some audio feedback on your computer.
I don't, unfortunately. Shoot.
Okay. Well, we'll suffer through. That's it. That's the nice thing of the agile.
I was going to say, in the spirit of agility,
we'll just work our way through that.
Yeah, the only thing I can suggest to you is maybe just turn your volume down on your speakers if you can, just a little bit, enough for you to hear, but maybe so it doesn't pick up.
Yeah, that might work. But while Jim is doing that, I think the other aspect that you guys are touching upon is how we have to act as leaders in the agile environment. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, and I know we've talked about this before, but the McChrystal book, Team of Teams, I think two of his themes are about context and transparency, which suggests that, a leader's less today about providing direction and about providing context, because we have to set up the environment to make the decisions, as opposed to making the decisions ourselves. Because I remember when we were working, Kathy, with a bank in Brazil, one of the comments was, can one person control 2,000 people? And practically, you can't do that anymore. The command and control culture it's just not going to work in an agile type of environment.
Well, and by the way, there are tons of studies that have come out. There was a study that came out in 2015 around strategic execution that showed that the organizations that are most successful at executing on their strategy are the ones that where the execution is driven from the middle. It's not driven from the top. So that command and control. Now, what's interesting about this study, by the way, and it was in HBR, if anybody's interested, Harvard Business Review, March of 2015. What was interesting about this study is they looked at over, I think, 300 companies. They all were companies that were highly complex with lots of ambiguity and volatility, which is those organizations that need agility. But it was interesting because, clear empirical data that said, we can't do causality very well in these kinds of studies, but certainly the correlation between driving it in the middle, not from the top, and successful execution. So just another sort of study that validates the work of Team of Teams, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But all of this is based on uncertainty, because how do you make decisions in an uncertain environment, whether you're the leader, whether you're the team, whether you're an individual contributor? And Kathy, you've done a lot of research on uncertainty. So is there anything that leaders can learn about managing in that?
Well, so the first thing, thank you for mentioning that. So that one, I think I sent you this sort of outcome slide, and not that one, but the other one. Yeah, this is so interesting to me. So if you think about, because all of us work with lots of different kinds of organizations, every organization wants good outcomes. And so I'm going to steal from a woman named Annie Duke, who's a professional poker player, wrote a book called Thinking in Bets. I recommend it highly. And she basically says when she has a poker hand, the outcome of that hand is based on two things. Number one, the cards she is dealt and her colleagues are dealt, right? And how she plays the card. So she would argue there's two levers if you want good outcomes, because that's at the end of the day what we want. There are two levers. You can build your skills, or you can manage, there's a piece that you can't control. She calls it luck. We have a colleague at Wharton, Cade Massey. He talks about the role of chance. Mm-hmm. I'm going to call it uncertainty, right? Some people call it risk, but it's that idea of what you can control, what you can't. And I think we have concentrated a lot, particularly in executive education, on building skills, right? Decision-making skills, implementation skills, leadership skills, technical skills. But that managing uncertainty, that's the other piece. And I'll say one other thing, and then I'll hush and let someone else talk. I think it's so important for the strongest leaders understand that they need to make a decision when they don't have all the information. What that means is you cannot guarantee a good outcome, but you can raise the probability of a good outcome by pulling these two levers. And so it's not about your ability to predict what's going to happen. It's about your ability to manage uncertainties. And I think we see this time and again, and my golly, we see it right now for sure.
If I could build on that, I mean, two things. And Joe, you've mentioned this a couple of times. It's not the outcome of the decision, but the processes that you go through. Secondly, at least in my experience, and Bob, Kathy, Joe, be interested in yours, people, when they're under pressure, they become more short-term focused.
Absolutely.
And so things like scenario planning, which I hope we'll talk about in a moment, to me, help groups get more of that future external orientation. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, actually, I want to pick up on your thought, Jim, with a question to Bob, because I think Bob's racing experience about they basically, for those who haven't experienced it, back before there was COVID, he used to bring in a NASCAR pit crew and you would change the tires and as fast as you can as a team. And so that was the whole point. It was a very short-term goal under a lot of pressure, and right. Teams constantly broke down. Like, why do you think that was so, Bob, as in the context of this conversation?
Yeah, this is really good. This is right in the wheelhouse of where things fall apart. The groups think they're doing great, right? They get into the tactics, and they get into those weeds, and they're in it. And when it comes to making decisions, they think they're making the right decisions, and a lot of them are based on tactics. What they look at is past metrics to determine future performance. And I catch them on it every single time, because past behavior is not necessarily a predictor of future performance, particularly in an uncertain world that's constantly changing. But where they miss it is it comes right back down to their values, right? And what's important. And we talk about agility. Agility is customer-centric, customer-focused. So they miss the customer. They miss talking to the customer to find out, is this shift what you're looking for? Is it part of what you want? Instead, in that short term, rush to decision, they make it based upon what they thought the customer wanted. Well, if it's agility, if the world's moving because your customers are moving, let's be very clear as to why the world's shifting. Is because the customers are asking for these different products and whatnot. If they weren't asking for it, we wouldn't be shifting, right? People are still putting gas in their cars today, but they haven't been much for the last few months, actually. And let's see where that goes in the future. But they're still asking for it, maybe not as much as we move. But what it really comes down to is knowing the context of. It comes back to that context piece. But they miss it on going back to their values when it comes to making decisions. And customer is one of those values.
I think customer centricity is a lot. And I want to come back to that in a second. But before we do, we actually did have an audience question. It looks like it's for you, Kathy. You probably were listening to what you said. So from Andy Smith. And he asked about if you could comment on the effect of shocks and how that impacts Agile organization. Because we've had a lot of external shocks recently and continue to have them.
So first of all, Andy, thank you for the question. It's a great question, and the good academic answer, it depends. I don't know. This is tough. One of the things that I talk about a lot, and it really means something now, I think, is how can you? I think part of agility is anticipating where you may need to pivot. So you make a decision, and now you're executing on the decision. But you may have to pivot to get to where you want to go, right? Maybe you know where you want to go. So a lot of talking about how do we anticipate, and that means we have to think about what are our key uncertainties. Those are known unknowns. You use the term unknown unknowns, which I love. That's the black swans. This is a tough one, right? And by the way, I will never, ever have to look for an example of a black swan or an unknown unknown again, because that's exactly what COVID is. I would argue that if you as an organization build the capability to actually be anticipatory, where you're looking for early indicators of change, that you have a better chance of being able to weather these shocks because you're naturally looking for, in fact, I think about, and I promise I'm not going to bore you too much, but I remember when I was first married in the 1980s, my husband and I lived in Carmel, California. If your marriage can't make it there, you're not going to make it at all. So, and that the big earthquake of 1987 happened while we were there. And I remember we had a yellow lab. And those of you who have ever had dogs know anything about this with earthquakes, we had aftershocks. Our dog, Ben, would just a smidge before we'd have an aftershock, would jump up because we had aftershocks for about a week afterwards. He would sense it just that half a second before we knew an aftershock was coming, and they were pretty strong. And so I just think that it's kind of like that ability that we build. I know, Joe, you had just shown that slide where I talk about what are the key uncertainties. You got to identify that, tracking those uncertainties, looking for the early indicators. And then, of course, we can talk about how do we experiment. But I hope that helps. It's, a shock is a shock, but I do believe that if an organization continues to build that capability to anticipate the known unknowns, it helps you with the known knowns. I mean, the unknown unknowns.
So I want to say I heard two things, Kathy, as I was listening to you, that I think are addressable to the question we got from our audience. The first one is basically we have to have those sensors out there. And that's the point. If we're not looking for the change, then we're going to be shocked when the change comes. And even if we know it's coming a little bit faster, the fact that we know that change is coming, we're actively looking for it, is something that makes an organization more resilient. And I think the other piece that was also mentioned by both you and Jim are the idea of scenarios. Yeah. Because essentially, if you're thinking in terms of scenarios, even if it's a worst case or a low probability scenario, then you're not going to be surprised. Because I think what's also behind the question is what happens when you're surprised, and that's when people probably experience the most shock. And so it's almost like if you can kind of think about the bad case, not to be obsessed with it, but that you're not surprised by it, then you'll have more resilience, or as what Duckworth calls grit. Does that make sense, Jim?
Absolutely. And, to build on what Kathy and you both have said, to me, there's an additional two parts. One is you still need to continue your current business. So, but what is that current business? What is that core? What is that non-negotiable part of what you're doing? But at the same time, how do you free up some resources to experiment? And the entities, in my experience, that get into trouble when they hit one of these shocks, maybe they haven't been scanning, maybe they haven't done scenario planning, it's they don't have those investable resources. There was a big McKinsey study of firms that came out well from major economic downturns, groups like Kellogg versus Post cereals during the Depression. And it was the entities that actually ramped up their advertising during the downturns that did better afterwards. Yeah. So part of this is that balance between core and future opportunities.
Actually, Jim, there's another McKinsey article that I think is also relevant, just to add to what you said, that just came out that basically said that organizations that were practicing Agile principles before a crisis did much better in the crisis.
Yeah.
And an example, a real one that just, I was so impressed. Tomorrow, I do this other show, and we have the chief medical officer from MedStar, and did a pre-interview. They gave us some data. Think about this with COVID-19. In March, MedStar, which is a $6 billion health system with 4,000 physicians, did 2 telehealth visits per day as a system. And the plan was eventually to get people on telehealth medicine. Within 1 month, they had 7 days, they had to go to telehealth overnight. And they were doing 4,000 visits per day in 1 month. They rolled the system out to 4,000 doctors. And as of July 4th, they've done 275,000 telehealth visits.
See, this is the opportunity.
5 months ago.
Yeah, this is the opportunity in times of challenge. And I want to refer back to something Bob said too, before we maybe look at scenarios. There's a fundamental difference in risk management and dealing with uncertainties. Risk management, you have a distribution of possibilities. In true uncertainty, and you implied this, Bob, in true uncertainty, the past is not prologue. If you continue to look backward and say, well, how did we do in the 2007, 2008 meltdown? Those aren't the lessons you want to be taking forward in times of true uncertainty.
In decision sciences, my field, we talk about, it's funny you talk about that, because we have a very narrow definition of risk. We consider risk as an uncertainty that we can mathematically model, that we can put a known probability distribution, which is a real difference, right? Well, one other thing, when you were talking about the telemedicine, anybody who's listening, if you go to the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics, LD, I'm a senior fellow there at University of Pennsylvania, you can find a talk by a guy by the name of David Ash. He was a former executive director. I think some of you know David. He's a physician at Penn, but he is also executive director now of their innovation center at Penn Medicine. And he talks about all of these things that they had been experimenting with prior to COVID, that they just, nobody's going to be interested, but they did it anyway. Things not just like telehealth, but how do you use texting, et cetera, et cetera. He said, if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't be nearly as prepared. It's all about that, building that capability. I think it's so important.
Yeah. Well, actually, the other part of the MedStar story is MedStar's CEO has been pushing systemness and experimentation and agility for years. Absolutely. And so I think whether it's part of the culture that you get into, which is ironic because right before the call, we were also talking about another guy, legendary CEO Jack Welch. And I was showing a quote that I love from him about he predicted his own firm's demise. Because in the 2000 GE annual report, he was prescient and he actually predicted the end of GE when he said, "We've long believed," there's a quote from him, that when the rate of change on the inside becomes slower than the rate of change on the outside, the end is in sight. The only question is when. And that's the point, is that the market is moving. It's moving at a faster rate. And if you're looking backwards, then you're not noticing the changes. And if you're not keeping up, then you can't be agile. And I think that becomes a secret to continued success.
You know, and to that point, Joe, and I'd be interested in Bob and others' reactions to this, doesn't that also argue for diversity? I think too many organizations, the senior team tends to be elderly, tends to be long-term players, and maybe they don't have quite as flexible a perspective as what we need when we're talking about these situations. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you, right? So it goes back to Kathy's discussion around risk. So we've got risk from the organizational perspective, but we cannot ever discount one's own individual risk. There's so many decisions that someone has to make on a daily basis just to protect themselves. And whether my career will be impacted, my job will be impacted by this decision I'm about to make. I just read a report that Lieutenant Colonel Vidman has decided to retire because his own personal ability to move in the organization, in the military, has been completely discounted. So he says, if I want to grow in my world, I have to do it somewhere else now. So there's a decision that he's made because of risks he took, et cetera, et cetera. We all know the story. So I think we often tend to look at organizational risk, and we have to look at the individual risks. And the older one gets, right, you're going to look back on your own personal experiences. And we're not necessarily capturing those who are coming into the organization, right, younger, more diverse in geography, ethnicity, race, all sorts of different things like that are really going to put us on a better plane. So I 100% agree with that.
Pulling two of these things together, that's so true. And thinking about experimentation, right, and how important experimentation is to being agile, and there's risk to that in some organizations. Absolutely. Can't tell you how many times we've all heard senior leaders say, "Oh, I want my managers to be more risk-taking, want them to have a higher tolerance for failure." And people are like, "I don't think so."
Yeah.
But I have a question I want to pose to you guys, because I believe, and now this is purely, there is no research behind this, it's just me talking, my anecdotal evidence over the last 3 months. It seems to me that my clients with whom I'm talking, I've never seen a higher tolerance for experimentation than I've ever seen before. In other words, it seems like organizations are more willing than they have ever been, that I've ever noticed, because while they talked about it, not really encouraging it. And now, and I guess my hypothesis is it's because doing it the way we've done it in the past just
isn't going to work.
We're not going to be able to do that in the future. At least some things. We don't know which things will be able to go back to normal or not. But it just seems like there's more tolerance for it. You guys experiencing that? I mean, is that anecdotally?
So I think, Kathy, as I hear you say that, I'll use a slightly different word, but I think it goes down to perception, and it goes back to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think that's, in corporate America, one of the reasons when we talk about disruption that companies get in trouble is hubris. Because when they're successful, of course they're going to do what they've always done. Why would I want to do anything different? And so it's the point when you're less successful, then the other quote is freedom's just another word for nothing less to lose. Like at that point, you're more willing to change. So I think it's really in times of crisis that people are willing to change and probably willing to take risks. We're in steady state times. Why would I want to rock the boat? And I guess that's the difference with Agile. Is Agile organizations are not complacent in steady state times. They're always on the, we have to basically assume that the doom is near before, I think you called it productive paranoia, Kathy. But
that's
to be productive.
Collins, not me, but yes.
Rather than waiting
that all the time
to actually happen. I don't know.
That's one of my favorite expressions, by the way. I love that. And that is Jim Collins from his book, Great by Sport, which is a fabulous book. But that idea, if you have a culture where, you're questioning what we're doing, now here comes negative Nelly now, right? Here comes that person, as opposed to saying, wow, let's embrace this.
Well, I think this is really an important thing you hit on, because from my perspective, because of the unknown, everybody's now in the same boat. And so now I can try something because the risk level doesn't seem necessarily as high. This happens in actually the Pick Crew Challenge. What's great about it is there's a good chance when people do our program, they've never changed tires on a race car before. And whether you're a senior level executive or you're the guy that sweeps the floors, you're basically in the same boat. And it puts everyone on an even plane very, very quickly. So when people are sharing ideas about how to, change the tires or make decisions on how they should do things, it's very equitable. And people immediately go into this coaching culture and feedback, regardless of the level that they're in, or for that matter, the level of risk. So I think from a market perspective, part of what COVID has done is put us on an even plane, and I can take the risk because everyone else has the same risk. We're kind of all in trouble. That's maybe a hypothesis, my hypothesis perhaps. But it's curious, and Kathy, you would know, if I asked you this question, if we were brainstorming and we're trying to come up with the answers for a question, right? What's the number of items that people would usually stop before they make a decision? How many would you get on the list? What would you say?
Oh, that's a good one. I 6.
Yeah, 6. And what we know from research that if you get down to 20, the most creative ones are usually where?
Is it 18, 19,
16, 15, 19, right? Those are the ones that are out there and far more creative. Yeah. But most organizations stop at 6.
Yeah.
And where did 6 come from? My regular context, the data we've always collected, the way we've always done things, et cetera, et cetera. And you might find the odd one that someone got ahead and gave you a really good one within the first 6. But we find when you actually do the exercise, when we're facilitating something like that, we try to push the group to get to 20. If you can go further, that's even better. But the better one, or I'd say the more creative ones, more out there that may be worth exploring, are far further down in the list than in the top. And we stop way too early. Because again, in this agility piece, we have to move fast, Well, again, we can still come up with ideas quickly, but we have to be careful where we stop.
Yeah, but fast is not enough. I just want to say fast is not enough in agility.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, don't give me that. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, when we started coming up with ways to measure agility, we started to look very quickly at data, because I'm a metrics guy, and I wanted to come up with like a dashboard. And when I did the Agile dashboard, speed was the first metric, but I realized speed was not going to be enough. Yeah. And so we actually came up with 2 additional metrics, which I think lead to the point you're talking about, Bob. The second one is what I started calling interaction. And again, because I was doing this with Duke, we were using the Duke basketball team as a metaphor, because that's what Duke likes. Can't use football with Duke. But in any event, but the point was, if you're a basketball player, like the first thing they're going to measure you is how fast you run, how fast you do the 40-yard dash. But the second thing they're going to do is, can you actually, where you're going down the court, like see ahead of you, figure out where to go, kind of like predict the move, how you're going to beat the players, where the team is going to be lined up to make the play. But what we've also started to distinguish is there was the ability for people to figure out where they want to go, but then there was the ability to execute, which was completely separate. Because you might know as an organization that you need to change, like you got the sensors out there, but your actual ability to get there, you don't have the capabilities to do that.
But, Joe, and to that, I think there's an ongoing tension of once we're out of this, once you have more sustainable environment, what's that tension between execution and experimentation?
Yeah.
And at least in my experience, the groups that do better going forward both have that execution orientation, have that high accountability, but at the same time almost challenge themselves through bringing in new people, through whatever, of what are we going to try? And maybe with the current situation, it's opening up the opportunities to try new things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's given, so permission. Permission is one of my biggest things that I talk about lately. It's my favorite word is giving yourself permission and giving everyone else permission. I think that's one of the best leadership qualities we have is I give you permission to do your job and I'm not going to be on top of you, but I give you permission to serve the customer. I give you permission. And it's when we feel permission. It's exceptionally powerful. And I think that's it. Right now we globally have permission to try stuff.
Well,
we have to.
And the other part of that is I did a program with Colonel Pilar, who at the time was the most senior female at West Point and taught history. She said that one of the keys to promotion within the Army today, have you left a better team than what you started with?
Yeah.
And I think that is so fundamental. Not what I did. Have I imbued the capacities, capabilities of those around me?
So let me ask you another word thrown out there. Thought of this, right? It's not a really complete sentence. As you guys are talking, the word trust is flashing in my mind. How important is trust to all of this?
Well, there was a great Harvard Business Review article by Zach a couple of years ago, I want to say 2017, The Neuroscience of Trust. And he basically boils down to 7 items. The top 3, though, were, do you allow employee choice in their position? Do you allow employee choice within how they get their job done? And do you as a leader show vulnerability?
Yeah, really, really critical. Kathy, did you also said something about work with Heidrich on trust as well, social trust?
Oh, so this was interesting. You're talking about this. So show those, if you can, show these scenarios. It kind of ties into, it was interesting. So just going back to scenario planning, and I think, Jim, you may have mentioned it, or I did, or Joe, something briefly. There's all sorts of methodologies, as we all know, for scenario planning. Heidrich struggles, and actually some former colleagues of Jim and myself put together a set of scenarios on the future of work. And the scaffolding, if you will, was 2 different uncertainties. And this is post-COVID. And one is, as you can see, the economy, what's going to happen, is it going to be a recession or is it going to be, a rapid recovery? But the other one was social trust, which is fascinating. And so they felt like that's one of the key uncertainties about what the future of work is going to be. And so that's not necessarily organizational trust, but social trust. But you can see how they painted 4 different worlds around the future of work, which I think actually these scenarios can be used in lots of different contexts. But one thing about scenario planning, and then Jim, I'll let you comment, at least in this methodology, it's not predictive.
Right.
Rather, it's supposed to just help you think about what might be possible scenarios. That's only 4 scenarios out of an infinite number that can happen, but it at least stretches your thinking.
No, and Kathy, that's so well. Joe, if you could put that back up again.
Oh, sure.
That point 1, as Kathy stressed, this is not predictive. Philip Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania, he studied forecasters. He said his basic conclusion is forecasters are as good as flipping a coin. None of us know the future. So it's all about how can I perceive different situations? How do I prepare myself? So the role of scenarios is really just to challenge our current mental models, our current perspectives. And it then sets up a strategic dialogue. What if? What should we be scanning for? What do we want to be watching for? And then once you have these, you periodically come back and update them or ask your team, where are we? Bob, Joe, Kathy, other comments on this?
No, I think you're dead on point there. And I think the key is that scenarios don't give you answers. They actually probably give you more questions, but they help you start to focus on some things to think about. Because I'll give you another example. In the book Scaling Up by Huggy Rao, what I really like is he talks about doing what he calls pre-action reviews. And he says, write the story of success, write the story of failure, and then go back and look, and like those are the things that you got to manage. And I think it goes right back into Kathy's known unknown framework that you always articulate in your sessions.
Yep. You know, one other thing, just sort of on that, thinking about sort of an argument for both agility and scenario planning. And you, Bob, you sort of touched on this in a different way. I again put my engineer hat on. When I think about forecasting is based on two things typically. It's based on historical data and our assumptions about the future, right? And so I would argue that in most cases, the further away you get from today, the less likely it is that you can accurately mathematically model the future. Oh, we try. Give me that 5-year forecast. But I would argue the further away we get from today, the less likely. And there's two reasons why. One is because, you know, the further we get from today, maybe we can't accurately mathematically model the uncertainties. Or as Andy said, guess that, hey, we get a shock that we didn't even expect. But secondly, and I think this is really relevant for today, and sometimes that historical data isn't relevant anymore.
Isn't relevant, right?
And so I think that's why I would love every decision to be data-driven, right? I love big data, predictive analytics, yay. But I just think that when we're talking longer term, and long term is getting shorter, by the way, but that's where scenario planning and really building that capability of agility is so important.
But don't I want to wait as a leader to be 90% certain to act?
That would be great if you could.
Bezos says 70.
It's not about the ability to predict. It's about your ability to manage the uncertainty.
No, I mean, to Kathy's point, if you need a 90% confidence level, you're only going to be citing things you see right in front of you.
You will, not be
and even then.
Absolutely. That's
But I guess, that close a feedback loop. The question we had 10 minutes ago was why are people having trouble with those, paraphrasing, scenarios of the future and what is really happening? I think that's, you just made the point, Jim, right there.
Yeah.
Exactly what people are having trouble with.
Yeah.
So,
now, one other thought, and I'd like everybody's reactions to this. I do think even in times of high uncertainty, there is some value in looking back to the sense of how did we perform when we tried to do X, Y, Z. Too many entities don't do those after action reviews or that real honest. I mean, if we're always 30% over budget and 6 months past deadlines for an IT project, if we're planning a new one in the future, why don't we assume that is the starting point? Yeah. So it's both what's the reality and how do we experiment?
All right, so I want to get practical here, just as we get closer to the end of our show. So if I'm sitting here in the audience, I'm listening, I'm like, all right, I know I got to act with imperfect information. I know I had to start sensing for the future. I know I had to do scenarios. So let me just, since we got the experts on the call, if I'm doing scenario planning, what are some of the top 2 or 3 things that you would recommend that I need to think about to do scenarios well?
Jim, you want to go first? Or go, you, Bob.
Okay, well,
go ahead.
I have to say this first. Sorry, Kathy. Talk to your customer.
What was that?
Talk to your customer.
Very good.
Yeah, you made it. Kathy.
I love it, Bob.
Okay, Bob, by the way, that's great. When I've done scenario planning projects in the past, I know Jim as well, sometimes we'll bring in those customers, right?
Right.
Because to me, one of the biggest, the most, in fact, you don't even have to do the scenario planning, but one of the most important steps is to truly think about what is it you know, the known knowns, and what is it you know you don't know, and make that distinction. Because if you know something's going to happen, whether you like it or not, you better be planning for it. But and there's so many uncertainties to be able to bound that and say which are the most important uncertainties for me, because that becomes the scaffolding for your scenarios.
And to build on that, to me, the end point of scenarios, not that there's an end point, it's always an ongoing iterative process, but the end point is what portfolio of initiatives are you and your team going to focus on. What 20% are going to drive 80% of your results? And I like a model, I call it the strategic pyramid. It's based on McKinsey's Horizons for Growth. What are the short-term initiatives you have to do to keep the doors open? Secondly, what are some new initiatives that allow you to expand into your adjacencies? And lastly, what are a few experiments? And these aren't 50 different projects. These are like a total of maybe 10 to 12. This is how LinkedIn does it. This is how various groups at Microsoft, some of Medtronic. How do you build that portfolio of initiatives that allows you to hit your short-term necessities while building some flexibility for the future?
So I want to add to what you said, Jim. As a finance person, we love our 2x2s. So here's
Right.
two 2x2s that you should do, which is take Jim's conversation and do two things. One, talk about what we call core and edge. Put your projects into core and edge, low impact, high impact. And the point is, what are you investing in? If 30% of your investments aren't into these edge businesses and you just keep investing in your core, you're doomed. Because if all of your projects just go back into doing what you're doing, you're never preparing yourself for the future. And I think that's a kind of Bain, McKinsey one. But the other thing is just do a simple prioritization, which is look at ease of implementation against how hard it is, how easy it is, against impact.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing, which is look at things that drive you to experimentation and then do some of the things that give you the quick wins. You don't have to make everything a moonshot. And that could actually help your organization kind of get some early success. That's what all the change models tell us we need to do.
Right.
So something else.
I like that. So I love that. I mean, quick wins really boost culture, right? They boost enthusiasm for the next win and then to try the harder stuff. So what can you win at quick is a great strategy. It may be low dangling fruit, but you get a taste for that fruit, you'll climb higher in the tree.
Absolutely. So, but I do want to drill down one more, Kathy. So when you said the things that you know about, they're easy to plan for. When you have those unknowns, what can you do?
Yeah, so I think that's where that's the managing part, right? That's I've made a decision. I know there's some uncertainties when I make it. I'm going to choose alternative A, but I know there are 5 big uncertainties that are going to have an impact on how I execute on that. And so let's dynamically monitor them. You're anticipating where you may need to pivot. I think that is just critical. So planning for the trend, but that managing those uncertainties means I'm thinking about, and scenarios help you do that, right? What would I do if this happens? So.
And Kathy, I assume that part of that is also, what are our metrics for success? Because if you don't agree those up front, when you start down the path and something changes, everybody goes, oh, well, just give me another 6 months. No.
Yeah.
Is that the best use of your resources?
Well, and so Jim, you were an actual manager at Baxter, unlike the rest of us academics out here. But in all seriousness, all right, we got our scenarios. We decide we want to act. Are there implementation things that you can help people think through? Because that's the next side. Once you're implementing it agilely, what are some of the things you should be thinking about as you start to implement agilely?
Well, it's all the comments we've been talking about throughout. And to me, the top 3 are: 1, am I iteratively coming back and looking at my choices? Number 2, do I have those success metrics? So we're all marching, because there's going to be unknowns. But at least if I've got some structure for making a no, go, an expand, contract, whatever, it's a lot easier than in the battle moment. And finally, am I constantly coming back to customers? I may be going down the wrong path. How am I willing to change? It's that quote that we were talking about earlier, Jack Welch again. Strategy is an iterative process that you frequently revisit based on changing market conditions.
Yeah.
Agility.
And what's interesting is this guy was so smart, predicting the doom of his own company, telling them what to do, and nobody listened. That's okay. Bob, you've run thousands and thousands of teams through the pit crew experience. Can you apply, based on what Kathy and Jim said, some lessons learned where they're doing these things and failing? And then how do they pick up the pieces and learn from failure and actually improve? Because I think you do that as you run more and more rounds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is such good stuff that we're talking about. And of course, in the program, we've got the practical part as well as we throw in that theory. We take great stuff. Kathy teaches stuff, and then they come see Pit Crew afterwards, and we see if they can get it in there, and they fail, and then we show them again. So. One of the things when it comes to, we talked about this on some of the other podcasts about, metrics and rewards drive so much of our decision making, again, personally and, divisionally. So that creates the silos that we tend to be in. Those silos make it very difficult for us to make decisions. And then it inhibits the agility of the organization to move around. So, what we always try to do with organizations is get them to look at their values from the outset and drive those values through the decisions that they're making. And then to recognize when those silos are there, how can we work across those silos, try to break them down as much as possible. And that all comes through, creating the right coaching culture and helping people drive the organization, benefit the whole organization as opposed to benefiting themselves. I think all those sort of principles play in on a lot of stuff that we're talking about. It sounds simple in language, but it's not that difficult in execution.
And by the way, I think the next piece, and instead of quoting Duckworth, I'm going to quote Rocky Balboa, being a Philly guy. But the idea is, he said in one of his movies, it's not that you get knocked down, it's can you keep getting up? And I think that's the other thing about failure is that we're all going to get knocked down. We're all going to get punched in the mouth. And so the question is, what do we do afterwards? And I think that's going to be the merit of the leaders in the organization, because if you expect that everything's going to be successful and you're going to run away at the first sign of failure, you're never going to be an agile company.
Right.
I think that's what the interesting thing, even when I experience your Pit Crew, is that people get knocked down. They have awful times, and then they get back up, and then they start realizing they got to go through things, and then they start doing it in a better way. And the willingness to do it in the better way makes all the difference, because you can't keep repeating, the same process and expecting a different outcome. Isn't that the definition of insanity?
Yeah, it is. And the key point is, in our program, we give them the chance. In other words, we don't fire them immediately when they mess it up the second time. We give them another chance. And
you fire them
with coaching, right?
You fire them the third time?
They get it a third time.
Isn't that called accountability?
And I'm about to get fired from here because I, in the spirit of agility, need to go to my next office hour.
No, and I appreciate Kathy. We are near the end of our time. So as we wrap up, and again, I want to thank everybody for being here. Just very quickly, Kathy, I'll let you go first because you might have to drop off. Can you give people that are listening a recommendation for additional reading based on what we've talked about?
Yeah, so two things. One is that Annie Duke book, Thinking in Bets. It's just a great read. It's very interesting, and it's a good read. The other is, if you're interested in research on strategic execution, a study Why Strategy Execution Unravels and What to Do About It, I think was the name of the article. It was in the March 2015 edition of the Harvard Business Review.
By Sol, yeah.
All right. And by the way, links to what we're talking about can be found at the learningcommunities.com website, including how to contact Kathy following this. So again, Kathy, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you all so much. I apologize for it. This has been so much fun, and I apologize for having to drop off.
No, feel free to go do some work. All right, thanks, Kathy.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.
Bob, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So since I've been jumping on the coaching bandwagon, I'm going to say my book is The Coaching Habit, Say Less, Ask More, and Change the Way You Lead Forever by Michael Bungay-Stainer.
Okay. And what's just real quick, what's the real benefit that he brings?
So basically it's the idea of, managing through coaching and, how to coach. Give some real practical ideas on how to coach your people and help to create that coaching culture. Okay,
great. And Jim?
And the two readings that I'd recommend, one is Hugh Courtney's Strategy Under Uncertainty. It's a fairly old article. I want to say it came out in 2000, but it's a great read on what he argues are 4 levels of uncertainty. The last one being what he calls chaos, which I would argue is where we are today. And he back then said chaos doesn't last very long. So really it's hunkering down, surviving that, and then being ready to go forth. The second one, and it really was sparked by some of Bob's comments, Gillian Tett's book called The Silo Effect. And silos are natural.
Yeah.
It's how we break them down that'll be
Right.
critical.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, again, I think really good readings, and I'll make sure we add that last one to the Learning Community site as well. The one I would give today is a book called Smarter, Faster, Better, subtitled The Transformative Power of Real Productivity by Charles Duhigg. Came out a few years ago. Before he used the word agility, it was all of the concepts of agility and a lot of what we're talking about today. Research-based, really good, practical book with lessons learned. And so again, this is going to bring us to the end of our time. Again, thank you guys very much for participating. Jim Austin at Jim Austin Associates, feel free to either find him on his website or find us Learning Communities to get to his website. And Bob Parker of the Pit Crew Experience, again, find him at learningcommunities.com or at pitcrew.com. Pitcrew.ca, sorry. Right?
Pitcrew.ca, yes, absolutely.
Because you're Canadian. Keep forgetting.
I'm Canadian. Otherwise, you'll find a real estate agent somewhere in Illinois or something like that.
But again, thank you guys for listening. If you want any more information or contact anybody, our web link is below. And as I like to say at the end of all these shows, you can't drive a car looking in the rearview mirror. Look forward to seeing you in the next office hours. The professors are out. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.